The can is cold in your hand. You crack it open on a Friday night, and the sound itself feels like permission, like something in your shoulders is allowed to drop. You don't think about where that relief comes from. You don't think about the yeast, the sugar, the fermentation, any of it. It's just a drink. Background noise at the end of a long week, but somewhere in your brain a very old switch is being flipped. One that has nothing to do with Friday, nothing to do with you personally, and everything to do with a smell your ancestors were chasing millions of years before anyone brewed anything on purpose. The question of when humans first discovered alcohol sounds like it should have a simple answer. A date, a jar, a first sip. It doesn't. And the real story starts long before humans existed at all. Picture a forest canopy in Africa, roughly 10 million years ago. No humans yet, no hominins even, just the ancestors of today's great apes, moving through trees thick with fruit. Fruit falls. Fruit sits on the forest floor. Fruit rots. And when fruit rots, wild yeast gets to work on the sugar inside it, breaking it down and releasing a byproduct. Ethanol. Low concentrations, nothing close to a modern drink, but enough to matter. Enough to smell. Here's where it gets strange. The biologist Robert Dudley proposed something called the drunken monkey hypothesis, and the idea is simpler than it sounds. Ethanol has a smell. That smell travels further than the visual cue of ripe fruit ever could, especially through dense vegetation where you can't see more than a few feet ahead. An ape that could detect the faint scent of fermentation had an advantage. It could find ripening, sugar-rich fruit from a distance, before competitors got there first. Over enough generations, the ability to detect and even enjoy that scent got built into the genome itself. This isn't speculation without evidence. Researchers studying the ADH4 gene, which produces an enzyme responsible for breaking down ethanol in the body, found something remarkable when they traced its history across the primate family tree. About 10 million years ago, a single mutation appeared in the ancestors shared by humans, chimpanzees, and gorillas. That mutation made the enzyme roughly 40 times more efficient at metabolizing ethanol than the version found in other primates. 40 times. That's not a minor tweak. That's a rewrite, and it happened around the same time our ancestors are believed to have shifted towards spending more time on the forest floor, where fallen, fermenting fruit would have been unavoidable. Sit with what that means. Long before there was a human being on Earth, before fire, before tools, before language, the body that would eventually become yours was already being shaped by alcohol. Not choosing it, not brewing it, just living inside a world where the smell of fermentation meant food, and the ability to process that fermentation without getting dangerously impaired meant survival. The craving didn't arrive with civilization. Civilization arrived on top of a craving that was already ancient. Now fast forward. Millions of years pass. Hominins split off from other apes, walk upright, spread across Africa, and eventually the world. Somewhere in that long stretch, a new possibility opens up. Instead of only stumbling onto fermented fruit by accident, what if you could make fermentation happen on purpose? That question brings us to one of the most debated sites in all of prehistoric archaeology, a cave on Mount Carmel in modern-day Israel called Rakafet Cave. In 2018, a team led by archaeologist Li Liu examined stone mortars from Rakafet Cave, used by the Natufian people roughly 13,000 years ago, thousands of years before agriculture, as we usually define it. What they found inside those mortars wasn't just evidence of grinding grain into flour, it was residue consistent with brewing, malting wild wheat and barley, and fermenting the result into something resembling a thick, low-alcohol beer. Liu and her colleagues argued this wasn't accidental spoilage. The grain had been deliberately prepared in a way that encouraged fermentation, likely for use in ritual feasting tied to burial practices. If that dating holds, it means humans may have been brewing alcohol before they were farming grain for bread. Think about how backwards that sounds compared to the story most people assume. The common version goes, humans invented agriculture to feed themselves, and alcohol came later as a lucky byproduct. The Rakafet evidence suggests something closer to the opposite is at least possible, that the desire for a fermented, mind-altering drink may have been one of the very pressures that pushed hunter-gatherers toward the painstaking, labor-intensive work of managing wild grain in the first place. Not survival driving alcohol. Alcohol possibly helping drive the earliest steps toward farming. This idea has a name among archaeologists, the beer before bread hypothesis. First seriously proposed decades earlier by researcher Solomon Katz, who noticed that wild grains are a strange first choice for a hungry population to domesticate. They're labor-intensive, low in immediate nutritional payoff compared to other options, and require processing before they're edible at all. But they ferment beautifully. Katz's argument wasn't universally accepted, and it remains a genuinely contested idea today. But the Rakafet residue gave it real physical weight for the first time, rather than leaving it as an interesting guess. The story moves east from here, and it gets even stranger. At a site called Jiahu in China's Henan province, archaeologist Patrick McGovern and his team analyzed pottery jars dating back roughly 9,000 years. Chemical residue inside those jars revealed a fermented beverage made from a striking combination: rice, honey, and fruit, including hawthorn and grape. McGovern has called it, in his own analysis, the earliest chemically confirmed alcoholic beverage found anywhere in the archaeological record. Not a single ingredient. A deliberate mixture, blending a grain, a wild fruit sugar, and pure honey together, as if the people brewing it were reaching for every fermentable sugar source available to them at once. What's genuinely surprising here isn't just the age, it's the sophistication. This wasn't a lucky jar of spoiled porridge someone decided to drink anyway. Combining rice, honey, and fruit in specific proportions to produce a stable fermented drink implies people who already understood, through observation and repetition, what worked and what didn't. Trial and error passed down, refined, and repeated across generations, thousands of years before anyone in that region had writing to record the recipe. Here's a detail that rarely makes it into the popular version of this story. Alcohol in the ancient world was almost never just a drink. At both Rakafet and Jiahu, and at countless sites afterward, fermented beverages show up specifically in burial contexts and ritual feasting, not every day, casual meals. The earliest deliberate alcohol wasn't a Tuesday night habit. It was sacred, difficult to produce, and reserved for moments considered significant enough to justify the effort: honoring the dead, marking a gathering, sealing an agreement between groups. Scarcity and ritual, not routine, defined its earliest role in human life. That scarcity is the hinge this whole story turns on, because it explains something modern researchers find genuinely puzzling: why alcohol tolerance varies so dramatically across human populations today. Roughly 1/3 of people with East Asian ancestry carry a variant of a gene called ALDH2 that makes alcohol metabolism inefficient, producing the familiar flushing reaction after drinking. For years, this was framed simply as a deficiency. But some researchers, including geneticist Kenneth Kidd, have pointed out that the mutation appears to have spread and persisted in specific populations at specific points in history, in patterns that align suspiciously well with regions where rice-based fermentation was common early on. One proposed explanation is almost the reverse of what you'd expect, in a world where fermented rice beverages were sometimes safer to drink than contaminated water. A mutation that made people feel ill after drinking too much may have acted as a built-in moderation switch, protecting against the genuine dangers of overconsumption in populations where alcohol was already deeply embedded in daily and ritual life. Now bring this all the way back to the can in your hand on a Friday night. None of what's happening in your body in that moment is new. The pleasant lift you feel isn't a modern chemical trick your brain wasn't prepared for. It's a smell detection system 10 million years in the making, tuned in an ancient forest to find fermenting fruit before anyone else could. It's an enzyme mutation that let your distant ancestors process that fruit efficiently enough to make eating it worthwhile instead of dangerous. It's the accumulated trial and error of people in caves and river valleys who figured out, without writing anything down, how to turn grain and honey and wild grapes into something worth ritual and ceremony. What's genuinely new isn't the craving, it's the supply. For nearly all of human history, alcohol required real effort: gathering wild grain, malting it, waiting, fermenting, protecting the batch from spoiling entirely, often for a single celebration or burial rite a handful of times a year. Today it requires walking to a corner store. The 10-million-year-old craving didn't change. The barrier standing between you and satisfying it simply disappeared, almost all at once, in a blink relative to the timescale that built the craving in the first place. There's one more twist worth sitting with before this story ends, and it has to do with why alcohol feels social at all. Fermentation doesn't just happen anywhere. Wild yeast needs the right combination of sugar, moisture, and time, conditions that were never guaranteed and never came from a single source you could control alone. Gathering enough wild grain, or finding a reliable source of wild honey, or protecting fruit long enough for it to ferment without rotting past the point of usefulness, took more effort and more coordination than one person managing alone. Early fermented drink, almost by necessity, was a group project. You needed hands to gather, hands to grind, hands to guard the batch from animals and spoilage. Some anthropologists studying the origins of shared feasting have pointed to exactly this mechanical reality as a possible reason why alcohol and gathering became so tightly linked across nearly every ancient culture examined so far, from the Natufians to early China to later Mesopotamian beer rituals recorded in some of the very first written words humans ever produced. The drink wasn't just a product of the group, producing it required being part of one. That may be the deepest reason the can in your hand still feels different when it's shared rather than consumed completely alone. The chemistry hasn't changed in 10,000 years. Neither, it seems, has the instinct wrapped around it. So the next time you hear that hiss of a can opening or watch a bottle get uncorked at a dinner table, you're not just watching a modern social ritual. You're watching the tail end of a chain that starts in a forest that no longer exists, running through an ape sniffing the air for rotting fruit, through a stone mortar on a hillside in Israel 13,000 years ago, through a clay jar in China 9,000 years old, all the way to your hand tonight, without you ever noticing the distance it traveled to get there. If you made it this far, you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. We make videos like this one every week about ancient human behavior, about what your body still remembers, about the gap between the world you were built for and the one you actually live in. If that is something you want more of, hit subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it tells the algorithm that this kind of storytelling is worth keeping alive. See you in the next one.